a boy, born in a one-room log cabin, dirt floor, flickering firelight, no wealth, no privilege, no formal schooling. Yet this boy would rise to become the president who saved a nation. This is the story of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln is one of the most iconic figures in American history. But his story isn't just about the Civil War or the Emancipation Proclamation. It's about a man who clawed his way up from poverty, a man who knew loss, who wrestled with failure, who faced ridicule. And yet, he stood unshaken when the very Union itself was tearing apart. To understand Lincoln's greatness, we must begin where he began. On the frontier, in the unforgiving early 19th century. Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, in Hardin County, Kentucky. His parents, Thomas and Nancy Hanks Lincoln, lived in a rough, dirt-floored cabin. The frontier was wild. Life was hard. Families struggled with hunger, disease, and back-breaking labor. As a boy, Lincoln was tall, lanky, and awkward. But what set him apart wasn't strength. It was his hunger for knowledge. His father, Thomas, couldn't read, but young Abe devoured books. He read by firelight, borrowing anything he could find: the Bible, Aesop's Fables, Pilgrim's Progress. His mother, Nancy, died when he was just 9 years old, likely from milk sickness, a frontier plague caused by tainted dairy. Lincoln later said that his angel mother shaped his moral compass. Her death left a deep wound. His father remarried, bringing in Sarah Bush Johnston, a warm and nurturing stepmother who encouraged Abe's learning. She treated him as her own, and Abe, in return, cherished her all his life. Lincoln's youth was filled with chores. He split rails, plowed fields, and endured endless farm labor. But he dreamed of more. When neighbors saw him walking with a book tucked under one arm, or scribbling math problems on wooden planks with charcoal, they began to whisper, "That boy is different." The frontier also taught Lincoln storytelling. At gatherings, young Abe would spin tales, mimic preachers, and entertain crowds with homespun humor. Even then, his words carried weight. By his teenage years, Lincoln was restless. The world beyond the farm called to him. He worked as a flatboatman on the Mississippi River, drifting down to New Orleans. There, he witnessed the brutal reality of slavery firsthand. The sight haunted him. It planted seeds of moral conviction that would grow stronger with time. In 1830, the Lincoln family moved again, this time to Illinois. Abe was now 21. He was strong, with arms hardened by labor, but his ambitions pointed away from farm life. He struck out on his own, working as a store clerk, rail splitter, and surveyor. He failed more than once. He went into business, only to be crushed by debt. But Lincoln was relentless. It was in New Salem, Illinois, that Lincoln's legend began. Townsfolk remembered his honesty, so much so that he earned the nickname Honest Abe. His humor, his fairness, and his towering height made him a local figure. And soon, politics came calling. In 1832, at just 23 years old, Lincoln ran for the Illinois state legislature. He lost, but 2 years later, he won. And with that victory, a new chapter of his life began. The self-educated farm boy stepping onto the stage of American politics. But destiny was not rushing. Before greatness came struggle, heartbreak, and lessons carved in pain. Part 2. The conflict Abraham Lincoln had made it. The once barefoot farm boy was now a state legislator in Illinois. But even here, he was still the outsider. He was awkward, gangly, with little formal schooling. Many rivals mocked his backwoods manners. But Lincoln had something they didn't: an unshakable drive. He studied law books late into the night, teaching himself the craft word by word. And by 1836, he had become a licensed lawyer. In Springfield, Illinois, he built a career brick by brick. Courtrooms became his training ground. Jurors admired his honesty, his plain-spoken style. He could turn a jury not with fancy rhetoric, but with clarity, humor, and truth. One client later said, "When Lincoln spoke, you believed him." It was also in Springfield that he found love. Her name was Mary Todd, educated, ambitious, from a wealthy Kentucky family. Friends were puzzled. Mary was refined, Lincoln was rough-hewn, but she saw something in him. She once declared, "He will be President of the United States someday." They married in 1842. Their marriage would be filled with both devotion and turbulence. But politics was never far from Lincoln's mind. He served a term in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1847 to 1849, where he criticized the Mexican-American War. It was a brave stance, but unpopular. Disillusioned, Lincoln stepped away from national politics, focusing on law. For nearly a decade, he vanished from the political stage. Then, something happened. The issue of slavery roared back into the nation's center. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 allowed settlers to decide whether their territories would permit slavery. To Lincoln, this was dangerous. It threatened to spread slavery into lands where it had been banned for decades. Worse, it challenged the very principles of freedom he cherished. Lincoln was shaken awake. He returned to politics not for ambition, but for conviction. In fiery speeches, he condemned slavery not only as a political wrong, but as a moral wrong. He declared, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." This phrase electrified the nation. Lincoln was now a rising figure in the new Republican Party, which opposed the expansion of slavery. But to rise higher, Lincoln had to face one man, Stephen A. Douglas. Douglas, the little giant, was one of the most powerful senators of his time. In 1858, Lincoln challenged him for the U.S. Senate seat in Illinois. What followed became legendary: the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Crowds gathered by the thousands. Lincoln, tall and solemn, facing Douglas, short but fiery. For hours they battled on liberty, equality, and the fate of slavery in America. Lincoln lost the election, but he won something greater: national recognition. His words spread beyond Illinois. His stance against slavery, delivered with reason and passion, struck a chord with Northerners. By 1860, Lincoln was a leading candidate for President of the United States. The boy from the log cabin had come further than anyone imagined, but his rise coincided with America's darkest hour. The Union was fracturing. Southern states threatened secession if Lincoln won. The election of 1860 wasn't just about politics, it was about the survival of the nation itself. And when the votes were counted, Abraham Lincoln, self-taught, scarred by loss, driven by principle, was declared the 16th President of the United States. But instead of celebration, America plunged into chaos. The storm had broken. On March 4, 1861, Abraham Lincoln stood on the steps of the U.S. Capitol, ready to take the oath of office. He was no longer Honest Abe of Illinois. He was President of the United States, at a time when the Union itself was unraveling. 7 Southern states had already seceded, forming the Confederate States of America. Their leaders vowed never to accept a president who opposed the spread of slavery. Lincoln, in his inaugural address, pleaded for unity. "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies." But words could not stop the tide. Just weeks later, in April 1861, Confederate guns fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. The nation plunged into 4 years of bloodshed. Brother against brother. Farm fields turned into graveyards. over 600,000 would die. And at the center of it all was Lincoln. At first, many doubted him. He had little military experience. Critics mocked him as indecisive, unrefined, and overwhelmed. But Lincoln possessed something rare, a steady, unbreakable resolve. He spent nights poring over military reports, walking the halls of the White House in silence. His face grew lined, his eyes hollow from lack of sleep. But his determination only hardened. He cycled through generals, McClellan, Burnside, Hooker, each disappointing him in turn. The Union Army suffered defeat after defeat. Newspapers sneered, calling for his resignation. Yet Lincoln refused to quit. "I walk slowly," he once said, "but I never walk backward." As the war dragged on, Lincoln faced a greater question. What was this war truly about? At first, he insisted it was to preserve the Union. But in his heart, he knew it was about more. It was about freedom. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. With the stroke of a pen, he declared enslaved people in Confederate states free. The war was no longer only about saving the Union, it was about ending slavery. The decision was bold, risky, controversial. But Lincoln believed it was just, and it transformed the conflict. Enslaved men fled to Union lines. Black soldiers joined the Union Army by the tens of thousands. The cause had gained a moral fire. Still, the war raged. In July 1863, the Union won a pivotal victory at Gettysburg. Months later, Lincoln traveled to dedicate the battlefield cemetery. His speech was brief, just 272 words. Yet the Gettysburg Address became immortal. He reminded Americans why they fought, that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. By 1864, the war was grinding toward victory. General Ulysses S. Grant pressed the Union armies forward. Sherman marched through Georgia. The Confederacy staggered. And though weary, Lincoln pressed on with quiet determination. He won re-election in 1864, carrying the hopes of a divided but enduring Union. By April 1865, the Confederate capital of Richmond had fallen. General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was over. Abraham Lincoln had done it. He had held the Union together. He had struck a fatal blow to slavery. The promise of America had survived. But Lincoln's story was not yet finished. In fact, his greatest test still lay ahead. The Civil War was finally ending. Spring of 1865 brought hope to a nation drenched in blood. Confederate armies were collapsing. The Union had prevailed. For Abraham Lincoln, this was the moment he had dreamed of: a healed America. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The war, at last, was over. Crowds filled the streets of Washington, waving flags, singing, weeping with joy. Lincoln stepped onto the White House balcony to speak. His words were gentle, forward-looking. He spoke not of punishment, but of reconciliation. "With malice toward none, with charity for all," he said. He urged the nation to bind its wounds and move forward as one people. But even as peace dawned, hatred brewed in the shadows. In Washington, an actor named John Wilkes Booth seethed with rage. A Confederate sympathizer, Booth despised Lincoln. He whispered of vengeance, of striking down the man he blamed for the South's ruin. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Lincoln and his wife Mary attended a play at Ford's Theater, Our American Cousin. The president seemed almost at peace, laughing at the comedy, unaware of the plot unfolding behind him. At 10:15 p.m., Booth slipped into the president's box. He raised a pistol. A single shot rang out. Lincoln slumped forward. Panic erupted. Mary screamed. Booth leapt to the stage, shouting, "Sic semper tyrannis!" Thus always to tyrants. The president was carried across the street to a small boarding house. Doctors worked through the night, but the wound was fatal. At 7:22 a.m., April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. The great emancipator was gone. The news spread like wildfire. Bells tolled. Newspapers printed black borders of mourning. Crowds gathered in silence, stunned, broken. The man who had led them through the nation's darkest trial was taken at the moment of victory. Lincoln's funeral train traveled from Washington to Springfield, Illinois. Thousands lined the tracks, standing in rain and mud, weeping as the black-draped cars passed by. In city after city, Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, millions paid their respects. His coffin lay in state, surrounded by flowers, guarded by soldiers, kissed by children. On May 4, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was laid to rest in Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield, not far from the humble log cabin where his life began. Lincoln's legacy was not just in victory, but in vision. He had preserved the Union. He had set slavery on the path to destruction. And more than that, he had given America its moral compass, the belief that freedom and equality are worth every sacrifice. His words live on. His example endures. Generations still look to him not just as a president, but as a symbol of resilience, honesty, and hope. The boy born in a Kentucky cabin became the man who saved the Union. And though death cut his life short, Abraham Lincoln remains immortal. If Lincoln's story moved you, remember this: history isn't just about the past, it's about who we choose to become. Share this story, keep the memory alive, and let Lincoln's courage remind us that even in our darkest hours, leadership and principle can light the way.